everybody, DeathsStalker here. Another beautiful sunny day after a weekend of horribly heavy rains and overcast weather. Sort of like what the MotoGP guys had down at Phillip Island, Australia for the Australian Grand Prix. So let's start off. Now, if you're aware of Phillip Island, it is of course an island, but the racetrack itself is right on the edge of the island, so it gets onshore breezes all the time. And you know, the riders are pretty much used to that, but you know, sometimes they get, you know, what would be considered to be almost gale force winds, which if you're driving at 300 kilometers an hour is not a good thing. But on the Friday they had rain in the morning, and they had a lot of it. And Fabio Quartararo was out running his free practice one, and he as a rookie has not had a lot of seat time in MotoGP bikes in the wet, so it takes a little getting used to. This is more horsepower than you normally would expect in a motorcycle, and even though the rain tires are state of the art, they do have limits. And Fabio was coming in having a reasonably good hot lap and had what would be called an off-throttle high side. In other words, you're not really on the throttle and the tire sort of slips and then it hooks up again and pitches you over the bars. Now these bikes have traction control, slide control, all that sort of stuff, but it only works really when the engine's working, because what it does is it slows the engine down a bit to reduce the impact. But if you're off the throttle and this happens, there's nothing to do. You're having an old-fashioned high side like used to happen in my era. And he got pitched off the bike, and high sides can be nasty, but he made a slight mistake as far as I'm concerned. Was he tried to hang on to the bitter end even once the bike was going over, and when he did that, he actually got pitched and landed right in front of the bike, and then the bike ran him over. And you could tell right away he was hurt. He was in a lot of pain, and he ended up with they call it a hematoma on his ankle, which is basically a very, very bad bruise. And because of that, and because of the pain, they had to give him some meds, so he ended up missing free practice 2, which was the only dry practice of the day. So he spent the weekend on crutches, but he will be back for the race, and I'll talk for that in a moment. So free practice 2 came out, and everyone else is pretty much, you know, riding along, getting their dry track time in. And the interesting thing was that the Yamahas were working really good here. Like Maverick Viñales basically looked like, after free practice 2, it looked more or less like everyone else just go home, he's going to win. That's how much stronger he was than everyone else. He had no problem whatsoever being at the top of the leaderboard, and he made it look almost effortless. Marquez, he was out there doing what he does, and he managed to break a new record, and that is the furthest leaned over a motorcycle has ever gone and not crashed. And MotoGP has the video out there, and I'll put a link to it. 70.8 degrees. He lost the front end of the bike and basically just fought it and fought it and fought it and fought it until he managed to get it slowed down enough. He was able to kick the bike back up and save it. And the marshals and the fans in that particular corner were cheering him, and he actually was celebrating as well, because that was an amazing save. And he would actually have another save later on in the weekend as well. It was pretty darn good as well. So he was being typical Marc. Now the weather called for rain on the Saturday morning, and it looks like it more or less held off. They had some rain, and they didn't, and then they had dry spots. It's sort of like wacky weather they get at Phillip Island. And the end result was that you know, the riders managed to get a little bit of time on free practice 3. Free practice 4 came out, it was sunny, but it was windy, and it was very, very gusty. And what happened was, one of the riders, I'm not going to say his name because I'm going to get it wrong, I'll just put it right here, racing for KTM, just was going down the pit straightaway, and as soon as you clear the area where the pit ends, that's an open area, and that's where you sort of see the wind really affecting people. And what happened was, as soon as he cleared that area, traveling at over 300 kilometers an hour, a gust of wind hit him and blew him off the track onto the grass. So he had no brakes, and he was heading for the wall at 300 kilometers an hour. And he basically realized he wasn't going to be able to stop it, save it, anything, and he bailed off. And he did the ragdoll thing, the bike did the ragdoll thing. It was a horrible, horrible crash. And right away they red flagged the practice session, and they asked for an immediate meeting of all riders, because they obviously this situation was very unsafe. And the riders had a discussion with the safety officials and the track officials and the race officials, and the end result was free practice 4 was canceled, and they were going to do qualifying on Sunday, weather permitting. And it's not the first time that this has happened, but it's the first time where they're actually going to try qualifying on Sunday. Normally what they would do is they would have whoever was the top riders in the various, you know, free practice 1, free practice 2, free practice 3, that's how they set the grid. But they were going to try to do qualifying 1 and 2 on Sunday. So that was basically it for Saturday. So Sunday comes along, and they actually managed to get some dry weather, and they had proper qualifying. And again, Maverick Viñales, unbelievably fast, got himself the pole. Fabio, you know, who was, you know, needed crutches to get on the bike, he went out there and he was number 2. And number 3 on the grid was not much of a surprise, it was Marquez. Now the part that made this so interesting was the fact that on the last lap of qualifying, Marc went out and he actually lost the front end in turn 1. That's one of the fastest corners in the track, and he managed to fight it and save it, and at the last second stood it up and rode it off on the grass. So that was his second big save of the weekend. Now you know, about 3 hours later they're back for the MotoGP race, and it was originally calling for rain, but the rain held off until the very end of the race. So we ended up with the usual suspects all lined up, ready to go. And surprisingly, Marc had said the hard tire was going to be the tire for him. Phillip Island has a real hard abrasive surface, so it tends to wear out tires very quickly. And several riders actually went out on the hard tire, but Marc and a few others went out in the soft. And the big surprise was when the lights went out at the start of the race, everybody took off. Marc had actually for him a very bad start, but Fabio and Maverick and Cal Crutchlow and whatnot, they actually had a pretty good start. And they go into the first turn, and Valentino Rossi went around everybody into the lead. And this was Valentino Rossi's 400th Grand Prix start, which is now giving him the most Grand Prix starts of any rider in history. Well, the Valentino, although he had a great start, the Yamaha still isn't that great of a bike, so it tends to, you know, still have some issues with tire wear and traction. And after a couple laps, he began to fall behind. Now Maverick has a problem usually with a full fuel tank, and he was sort of held up for a bit by a few of the riders, and eventually he was fighting his way to the front, and Marc was right behind him. And Cal Crutchlow was actually in the lead when Maverick went around him, and Marc, not wanting to get Maverick get away from him, actually made a pretty tough pass on Cal, actually knocking his leg out of the way as he went between him and the corner. And you know, some people were calling it pretty harsh. Cal didn't actually seem to be bothered by it, because he actually came from the, you know, production racing where there was a lot of banging of fairings and bodies to get by people on equal bikes, so he wasn't bothered by it. And Marc then went around and just proceeded to follow Maverick. Now Maverick was in the lead. It looked pretty obvious Marc was never going to pass him in a corner, but the interesting thing was, near the end of the pit straight, Simon Crafter actually had mentioned that it was obvious that Marc was actually closing the throttle early on the straightaway, so he wasn't trying to pass Maverick. He was just sort of biding his time. Now the interesting thing was that on the last lap, of course, Marc comes through, and this time he held the throttle wide open, and he actually passed Maverick into the first turn and kept him behind him. And Maverick was closing in, trying to get ready to try to take the lead back. And 3 corners from the end of the last lap, Maverick was getting ready to make his move. And unfortunately, Maverick's tires were pretty much shot. Marc said his tires were pretty much shot. And Maverick, as he was coming in to, I can't remember the name of the corner, but it was the start of a downhill section, his rear tire just sort of let go, then hooked up a second, and that was it. Maverick was down, and his bike went sliding by. It was sort of close to Marc by the camera view, but from other views you could see it wasn't going to hit him. But Maverick, you know, who had led most of the laps of the race, crashed out with 3 corners to go, which, you know, you feel sorry for him. Marc was absolutely ecstatic. He had gone in after the first practice session realizing he was probably not going to win this race. Maverick was too strong. The weather hadn't helped. Very few people got themselves a good setup. It was just horrible. Now, the one thing I actually forgot to mention was in the first corner, Fabio, who was, you know, right up there in the lead, had a slight wobble with his front tire and was drifting wide. And it was pretty obvious he was going to run off the track, and Danilo Petrucci in the Ducati was sort of behind him, and he had the same problem, but it was his rear tire. And Danilo got pitched off the Ducati and fired like a marble from a slingshot and hit Fabio just before he was to hit the grass, and knocked him over and ended both their races. You know, an absolute kind of a weird, fluky sort of thing. But, you know, unfortunately Fabio, you know, after all this trouble, found himself out. But it was overall a pretty good race. Next weekend we're heading on, well actually this weekend is the Malaysian Grand Prix, which is the second to the last race of the season. So I'm going to put links to any of the videos that are in available from MotoGP, so you can actually see some of these things. They didn't release as many videos as it did from Japan, at least so far, so hopefully they'll have some more. And hope you enjoyed this. Anyways, DeathsStalker signing off.